I'm Julie Schweitzer, and today you're looking at a presentation on ADHD. We'll be talking about fidgeting in ADHD and how it might actually be helpful for a child with ADHD, and also some of our newest information on different subgroups within the ADHD population, as well as a little bit about self-control and some of our newest findings in children without ADHD that might be informative for how we think about impulsivity and its development. We consider hyperactivity to be the most well-known aspects of ADHD because it's the most noticeable part about ADHD. It's often recognized as the most profound symptom as well. There's lots of studies for many, many years back showing that ADHD children are certainly more hyperactive, hence the name ADHD, but they're also more active during sleep. But typically, in the past maybe 20 years or so, there's been a lot less emphasis paid to the excessive motor activity in ADHD. Instead, most people are really focusing on the cognitive aspects of ADHD. But recently, there's been a set of studies from Mark Rapport, University of Central Florida, where he and his students have launched on a body of work that looks at motor activity in ADHD and found that it might actually be related to the cognitive aspects as well. In Mark Rapport's model, increased hyperactivity is associated with better cognitive performance. Initially, he showed there were higher rates of activity associated with more challenging tasks. In a fairly recent study, Dustin Sarver, along with Mark Rapport, found that higher rates of activity are also associated with better performance on a working memory task in children with ADHD. However, when they gathered their data, they looked at their data over the entire session. What we were interested in doing is looking at a trial-by-trial nature, whether or not the actual rate of activity or intensity of activity was related to cognitive performance. Because we were interested in how close we could see this coupling between physical motion in kids with ADHD and how well they performed in a challenging cognitive task in which we had them do an attention task. The children in this study were adolescents. They were about 14 years of age. We had 18 typically developing children and 26 children with ADHD. They were rather bright. Their IQs were in the high average range for both groups. The children in the ADHD group all had clinically significant ratings of symptoms of ADHD by their parent ratings, which were confirmed by teacher ratings when possible. The children in the typically developing group, however, their ADHD ratings were in the average or normal range. What we used during this task in the next study I'll talk about is something kind of flanker task. This is an attention task that requires good cognitive control. What I'd like people in the audience to do right now is to practice this so you get a feeling of what these children were doing when they were performing our studies. You'll see that there will be arrows pointing to the right and pointing to the left. When you see an arrow in the center, there'll be 5 arrows, but the center arrow is pointing to the right. What I want you to do is snap your fingers on your right hand, and when you see an arrow pointing to the left in the center, snap your fingers in the left hand. Ready? Here we go. Now those last couple ones may have tripped some of you up. You may have noticed after the arrows were presented that you slowed down, and that's because your attention was being challenged because the flanking arrows to the center arrow were pointing in a different direction. And when that happens, that requires good cognitive control. And that's the task that we use when children were wearing an actigraph strapped on their ankle. And what we did is we correlated their performance on that task, how accurate they were, with their intensity of activity as well as the frequency of their activity. And what we found was that overall, the children who were more intense in their movements also tended to perform the best on that task. And this was picked up by several media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other newspapers and radio shows. And I think probably because this resonated, this finding that we had, with many parents and teachers and children who had also been experiencing ADHD, as well as a number of adults who reached out to me in some emails. And so here are our data, and on the right side of the screen, you'll see we had 2 primary measures, something that we call PIM and ZCM. The PIM is what measure the intensity of the movements.
The DCM is what measured the frequency of the movements. And we found overall that the typically developing children were less frequent and less intense in their movements than the ADHD children. But we also found an interaction effect when we looked at accuracy for the intensity of movement. And so if you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that children with ADHD are in the darker bar, whereas the typically developing children are in the fainter gray bar. And you'll see for the number of incorrect versus correct for the typically developing children, their intensity of movement did not matter. Was not related to their accuracy. However, for the children with ADHD, you'll see when you look at the number of corrects, they were more correct and accurate on the flanker task when their intensity of movement was greater. So what are the implications and future directions for this study? Well, hyperactivity has really gotten a bad rap for many years. And people focus on it, and they really work hard oftentimes to get children with hyperactivity to be quiet and sit still. It turns out maybe they don't need to be so focused on trying to keep children with hyperactivity still. Instead, if they look at the perspective that fidgeting might actually be helpful for the child with ADHD, and the fidgeting might actually make them perform better on challenging tasks, that if their perspective changes, maybe they would spend less time judging and trying to get this child to keep still when it's something that's really challenging for the child. It may actually be a compensatory strategy for the child. Now, of course, we understand that fidgeting is bothersome to peers and sometimes teachers and others in the environment, and we fully recognize that there are certain situations where that excessive motor movement may really be disruptive. And we completely understand that really the next wave needs to be looking at how can we find ways that are socially acceptable and do not interfere with others, where somebody can get their energy out and not be disruptive while still helping themselves be more accurate and perform better on tasks. So in the future, we'd like to do some other studies where we get a better idea how this fidgeting might relate on an individual basis to kids with ADHD. And that includes looking at neural patterns. We do a lot of brain imaging studies in our laboratory, and we'd like to have a better idea if children who are fidgeting and are affected in a positive way by their movement produce different brain activity patterns than other children. If so, then we can have an idea about what are those children that might benefit most from interventions that allow them to fidget. And lastly, we really think that parents, teachers, and individuals with ADHD themselves need to think about ways that they can integrate movement into their day. And this might be doing exercise before you have to take a test, or it might be that when you're actually doing a learning task, that you are physically active during the task. Many teachers for years have noticed that it can be helpful for children to have people be more kinesthetically involved when they're doing a task. But perhaps with this new data, it could get people to think about this in a more concrete, purposeful manner. The next study I want to talk about involves children who have high ratings of sluggish cognitive tempo, sometimes also considered concentration deficit disorder. Although at this point this is not considered a bona fide disorder, we were really just looking at symptom ratings on sluggish cognitive tempo rating scales and how it correlated with performance and brain activity using fMRI studies. Sluggish cognitive tempo symptoms include daydreaming, drowsiness, or a slowness to respond. These are children who are more hypoactive in contrast to how we typically think of ADHD. These children are the ones who may be sitting in class and dazed and not able to follow what the teacher is saying. Similarly, at home, you would see the same thing where there may be activity going around the child and the child may be seeming to be off in a different state. Our children in our study exhibited these symptoms at home as well as at school. Our children also were primarily children who had the ADHD inattentive subtype, although some of our children also had the combined subtype of ADHD, but they exhibited these symptoms as well. The data suggests that these symptoms are very common within children with ADHD inattentive subtype. And initially, this study was undertaken within children who were all diagnosed with ADHD, and then we were really trying to focus in on children who we thought had a really pure ADHD inattentive type. And then we began to look at their SCT ratings. In terms of the field, over the past several years after the study has begun, the field has changed its perspective about sluggish cognitive tempo. And some people are saying that it's really a different disorder from ADHD. At this point with our group, we can't tell that because all of our subjects did have ADHD as well. In our study, our aim was to look at how inattentive symptoms versus sluggish cognitive tempo symptoms on rating scales were differentiated in neural activity. The way we did this is we had parent ratings of sluggish cognitive tempo, and we had the inattentive ratings as well, and then we correlated that with brain activity during the task you saw just recently, the flanker task. We had 13 typically developing participants and 18 children who had been diagnosed with ADHD. They were adolescents. We had a fairly high number of females in our group as well. They were all fairly bright. The majority of them were right-handed. In terms of their ADHD rating scales, we used a Connors rating scale, and they were significantly rated as ADHD either on the inattentive score or the inattentive and the hyperactive impulsive scale. Their sluggish cognitive tempo ratings were significantly higher in the ADHD group than they were in the typically developing group. And there was a fairly high rate of prescribing of medication for our ADHD group. In this study, we used the same test, a flanker test, but the cues that were presented before each trial were critically important in this study. The cues had different levels of information. Sometimes the cues were just up there to say that it was a difficult trial that was coming up, and that's what we call a general cue, and that would indicate that the central arrow was going to be in a different direction than the flanking arrows. That's what we call an incongruent trial. A congruent trial is where the arrows are all pointing in the same direction, and those are typically easier. Sometimes the cue also said actually which hand the participant would need to use to respond. Those are what we call the response preparation cues. And so they would signal whether they should get the right hand ready or the left hand ready, indicating that the central arrow will likely be pointing in that direction. Every once in a while we had a trick in there as well in terms of the cue, just to make sure that the kids were paying attention. And by trick I mean that the cue was not actually accurate. If you look at our behavioral data, you see that the cue is helpful. So the children typically were using the cues to help inform their responding. But the typically developing children who are in the blue line here versus the ADHD children use that cue even more so. And we can tell that because their response time was faster. And so that cue was informative and allowing them to respond more quickly on the trials. In each condition, the typically developing children were faster than the children with ADHD, but they all benefited from the response preparation cue, which told them which direction that central arrow would be pointing. In these images right here, this is what we call between group comparison in our fMRI data between the typically developing group and the children with ADHD. And in this comparison, the typically developing group were always more active in their brain activity than the ADHD group. And what you'll see is that when they were responding to that response preparation cue, that they had much greater activity in their brain. They responded to the warning cue, which was the more general cue, as well. So they had more activity in the sensory motor area. But when they had that specific response preparation cue, which told them which hand, that actually activated the right superior parietal lobe more in the typically developing children. Now we then looked at our relationship between the parent ratings on the SCT scale as well as the inattentive scale. And we found differential patterns of brain activity depending upon the scale. There was some overlap, but there were very clear areas where there were distinct differences. On the top trial, you'll see how the children responded and the differences to the rating scales and what we call the null cue trials. The null cue is when the information in the cues was not informative. The bottom part of the graph is when there were the response preparatory cues or the general cues. And in that situation, the cues were informative. But when you look at the top row, what you see is that there's a very distinct pattern. So the children who had higher ratings on the SCT ratings had much more brain activity in the parietal lobe. In contrast, the children who were higher on the inattentive ratings produced brain activity which was much higher in the sensory motor activity region. So when you look at the areas where there were green clusters, that's where there was a negative correlation between the sluggish cognitive tempo parent ratings and brain activity in the superior parietal lobe and the sensory motor area. And this is when we were not controlling for the inattentive symptoms. When you look at where there was the dark blue clusters, that's where there was a negative correlation with the sluggish cognitive tempo in the left superior parietal lobe. The light blue also indicated a negative correlation with sluggish cognitive tempo, but this time we are controlling for the inattentive symptoms. So that suggests, regardless of the degree of inattentive symptoms, children with high sluggish cognitive tempo ratings produce different brain activity patterns than those who just had the high inattentive ratings. When you look at the violet clusters, which is primarily in the center region of the brain, these are representing negative correlations between ratings of inattentive symptoms and brain activity in the thalamus. These ratings suggest that the more activity you have in the thalamus, the lower the parent ratings were for inattention. So, future directions. There's lots that still needs to be explored in regard to the sluggish cognitive tempo, but we recognize that this was a fairly small study, so this needs to be replicated with much larger samples. And our study only included children who also had a diagnosis of ADHD. And to answer the bigger question about whether ADHD is different from a sluggish cognitive tempo perspective, we also need to be recruiting children who have higher rates of sluggish cognitive tempo ratings who do not have the ADHD diagnosis.
Now I'm going to talk about a project which was spearheaded by my collaborator Walter van der Boos in collaboration with Dr. Sam McClure and Christian Rodriguez. This study is about how we gain future orientation and learn to become more patient over time. Adolescence is a particular period of time we're interested in, and this is a period where there's risk-taking and a lot of impulsive behavior, particularly in ADHD, but in typically developing children as well. And this is a slide from Dr. Rondell, which shows between the ages of 15 to 19, there's a particular strong increase in risky behavior that has very strong negative effects as well. We're interested in understanding what the neural mechanisms are and how they develop during this period of time. And a lot of the research has really been focused on a difference between functioning in the prefrontal cortex, which we think is being control and decision making, as well as reward related regions such as the striatum, and how through development those two areas of the brain interact with one another. And this study, we use a number of tools to try to understand how development in those different brain regions played out together to then increase self-control and the ability to think about your future and how future consequences related to current behavior. And the way we did that is that we used a number of measures, and we used something called a delayed discounting paradigm, where people made choices between immediate small rewards and much larger delayed rewards that were of much larger monetary value. These were all decisions people made about different amounts of money and over time, and they were able to actually win one of the rewards from one of their choices. We also gave them Zimbardo time perspective inventory, where they're rated their ability to think about the future and future consequences. We also collected a number of imaging measures. Imaging measures included diffusion tensor imaging, where we looked at the striatal tracts, and we performed connectivity analyses and with the DTI measures, as well as with some of our data from the functional magnetic imaging as well. So we used fMRI to acquire imaging data while people performed the delayed discounting task. We used DTI to look at brain structure, and we used this Zimbardo time perspective inventory, and we combined all these measures together to help us understand brain development and how it impacted one's decision making about choices between immediate and more delayed rewards. And what we found was the biggest change was really primarily in the prefrontal cortex rather than in the striatum. And there was also a change in regard to the connections between the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. And what seemed to occur based on our data from the Zimbardo time perspective index was that as people matured, they became more future oriented rather than less what we call hedonic or concerned about immediate rewards. So it was this ability to think about the future that seemed to change their behavior more than rather being more attracted toward immediate rewards. Then, as I said, we combined all of our data looking at connectivity between different brain regions, looking at structure and function. And it turned out that really the biggest change was also in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex rather than changes in the striatum. So what we actually saw in the DTI data was that we saw that there was an increasing in strength between the connections between the striatum and the lateral prefrontal cortex, with a negative correlation between delay discounting rates. So as this connection became stronger between the striatum and the prefrontal cortex, the discounting rates became lower, so people became more self-controlled. So there was a direct link between connectivity in terms of structure, and these data were informed by the functional imaging data that told us where to look in the brain, and they were able to correlate that with discounting rates and our delayed discounting paradigms. So people were not more attracted toward rewards when they were younger. What these data suggested as people matured, instead between that period of 17 to 25 years of age, their prefrontal cortex had more control over other regions of the brain. And that is how we think people mature over adolescence and young adulthood. These data were all collected in healthy adults. Now we are using these same methods to look at ADHD to see whether it's the same pattern that we see in ADHD. That is, whether really the differences are in terms of maturation in the prefrontal cortex and connectivity with their striatum, or instead in ADHD may we see a different pattern where perhaps in the striatum you see a decreased in terms of activity and perhaps a difference in terms of the striatal connections to other regions in the brain as well. So at this point it's an untold story, but we've been very actively collecting those data and are in the process of analyzing those data as well to see if the pattern that we see in ADHD is simply one of where it's more of a immature version of what we see in the typically developing adults, or if it's a completely different story. And so stay tuned. We hope to have our results within the next few months, and it will be informative for then to think about how we can personalize treatment, because the implications will be different if it looks like it's just more of an immature pattern of what we see in typically developing adults, or a different pattern, because then our interventions might be different depending upon what those data say. Thanks for watching our presentation on ADHD. For more information about ADHD and our program at the Mind Institute, please visit our website and sign up as a participant in our research studies.
The UCDAVIS Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.